is a simple explosive, as it has been so far, or whether it should be, as Saddam Hussein has threatened, a chemical attack. And as you say, within about, I would say 20 minutes, we were informed after the initial explosions that we could take off our gas masks.
All right, Chris Wallace, thank you very much. Standing by at the Pentagon, where he has been all night long, is ABC Pentagon correspondent Bob Zelnick. Bob, you were able to confirm relatively quickly through U.S. sources that those missiles had in fact been launched and had landed in Tel Aviv. I don't know whether anything is even popping at the Pentagon tonight. Has everybody gone home, or have you been able to learn anything new?
Ted, it's actually there are more people here now than there were when the Scuds first were fired. In fact, like our colleague in Tel Aviv, the people here thought they might have gotten through the night because they knew it was almost daylight in Tel Aviv. Now they're back. But in fact, there's very little new because the basic story is that 3 missile launches were detected by the U.S. from western Iraq toward Israel, and that's basically the story. If you want to look for a hopeful note in it, it's fewer missiles than were launched a night ago. There were 10 or 11 missiles launched last night. And in fact, during the day, the U.S. diverted many extra warplanes to western Iraq to try to hunt down these mobile missile launchers, these Scud launchers. During the day, 11 of them were destroyed. Many of the permanent missile launch sites were hit again. There are 30 or so of those. So, in effect, the threat, while we see it certainly hasn't receded altogether and can strike home with unpredictable force, the threat is in fact receding as we count the numbers of Scud launches that the Iraqis have left.
The damage, of course, is not so much military, perhaps, as political, and I want to switch over now to our colleague Ann Compton at the White House. And this is likely to have enormous political repercussions, isn't it?
Absolutely. The political damage from this, more so than the physical damage on the ground in Tel Aviv. Frankly, Ted, I think the president was steeled for this. He had just settled into Camp David, 60 miles from here, his weekend retreat in the mountains, when Brent Scowcroft, the National Security Advisor, phoned him with this news. The White House right now is totally empty. A marked difference from the frenzy here just 24 hours ago when the other missiles slammed into Tel Aviv and the White House went into overdrive trying to convince the Israelis that it would be absolutely wrong to make any kind of military retaliation. Their argument that this is exactly what Saddam Hussein was trying to achieve, bringing Israel in and fracturing the Arab coalition arrayed against Saddam. Right now, there seems to be no activity here at all, none of the crisis atmosphere. President Bush did telephone Prime Minister Shamir in Israel. It's been, I guess, about 13 hours now, to publicly thank him for showing such restraint after the first round of attacks. The president assured Prime Minister Shamir that the U.S. was doing everything it could to go after whatever missile sites there were left in western Iraq, but he admitted from this podium it is a very difficult thing to find those. The president did expect that if there was another missile attack like this, that Israel would not be able to have to show such restraint. And it's ironic, Ted. The president was on the phone with Prime Minister Shamir for about 10 minutes. When they got off the phone, the two leaders found out that air raid sirens were already going off in Tel Aviv again. That, of course, was the earlier attack, that not attack, but the Soviet satellite booster that came down. But this comes as no surprise to the White House tonight at all.
All right, Ann Compton, thanks very much. And I just want to jump quickly to almost the other side of the world there in eastern Saudi Arabia, where Forrest Sawyer is standing by. Forrest, one would assume that the United States has been doing and will continue to do everything it can to knock out those Scud missile sites, and particularly those mobile launchers. Once again, things seem terribly quiet there where you are.
Well, it is surprising, Ted, the remarkable normalcy, if anything, in the past 2 days could be called normal here at this air base. During this time that we've been reacting to what's happened in Tel Aviv, we have seen the usual amount of F-15s and British and Saudi Tornadoes taking off from here. but really nothing more than that. And a mark of the complacency with which this place is responding to this, I can tell you that there were air raid scares last night. Nevertheless, just a little while ago, we watched a Saudi Airlines 747 land at a base right over here. Things are moving apace. The United States, I expect, is doing everything that it possibly can to find these mobile missile launchers, but there is no tremendous response at this base, and I expect no upgrade of response at other bases around the region.
All right, Forrest, we'll come back to you in just a moment. We're going to take a break, and then we will be back with more live coverage of this latest development of an Iraqi missile attack against Israel in a moment. In the morning here on the East Coast in Washington, D.C., just after midnight on the West Coast, and of course over in the Middle East right now, 10 o'clock in the morning in Israel, where roughly 3 hours ago at 7:15 in the morning their time, apparently 3, possibly more, but 3 is the best number we've been able to establish, Soviet-built, Iraqi-fired Scud missiles launched from the western part of Iraq, landed in Tel Aviv, causing a fair amount of damage, but basically human life at least was not lost. There do appear to have been some injuries, the number in question at the moment, but somewhere around a dozen or so people, some of them so lightly injured that they have already been released from hospitals. Standing by with me now is a military consultant to ABC News, Tony Quartersman. Tony, do you think we've seen the last of these yet, or is it possible that the Iraqis still have some more missiles that they can launch?
Ted, let me try to set the scene a little, and I'm going to try to use the map to give people an idea of what we are really talking about. We need to look down here first at western Iraq and understand something. We keep referring to the Scud missile. The truth is the Soviet-based Scud missile from anywhere in western Iraq cannot reach Israel at all. Its range is only about 175 miles. It can only be targeted against Jordan. So what we are really talking about is 2 other missiles. One is called the Al Hussein. That has about twice the range, about 375 miles, and it can be launched from a box in western Iraq and reach targets in Israel, a box of about 10,000 square miles. Now within that are a lot of pre-surveyed sites. It's a big missile. It does have storable fuel. We don't know all the details about it, but what we have to remember is that's an immense area to cover, even if we know every pre-surveyed site. These are small launchers. Iraq has had months to find ways to dig in shelters. It may have fixed launchers. We keep saying we know the number of mobile launchers, but at the Baghdad Arms Fair in 1989, Baghdad showed its own launchers, both fixed and mobile. And the intelligence people may have a count, but people keep using the number 36. There could be substantially more. We've seen so far what appear to be Al Husseins with very limited warheads. Now that's important because some people think that warhead is only about 500 to 750 pounds. Even with nerve gas, that would do very little damage unless it hit in an extremely heavily populated area. The odds are very much against that. But with that much space to hide in, they could have the capacity to launch at least a few chemical warheads for a long time to come. No one can guarantee that you can search a 10,000 square mile box quickly and efficiently, even if you have days. And there are 2 wild cards in this equation. Most people feel that the third missile they have, we call it a Scud, but in fact it is something called the Alabis. We know very little about it. It is a much bigger missile. It could carry a very serious chemical warhead, although again it's very inaccurate. That system seems to require fixed launchers. If we look back at the map, we can see that that could be launched from virtually anywhere in the western part of Iraq. You have something like a 40,000 square mile box to search. But if it requires fixed launchers or very well developed sites, those sites may already be dead. No one has given us any damage assessment of that capability. If it was launched, it would have to be against a city and against a population. To try to say that anyone, Israel or the United States, can find the last set of those launchers and missiles that may have been buried, hidden, even from our satellite capabilities, is extremely difficult.
Let me just interrupt you for a moment, Tony. You have referred a couple of times now to pre-surveyed sites. You mean these are sites surveyed in the sense that they already know that if a missile is fired from this site, they can roughly gauge where it's going to land?
Well, very roughly, because it assumes that the missile works. There's some questions about the Alabas. Even with pre-surveyed sites, it's unlikely that they could predict where it would land within more than 6 kilometers, perhaps 10 to 20. But without a pre-surveyed site, it might go into the Mediterranean. It might well go into Jordan. About half of these missiles could easily fall far short of their target, so Jordan may ultimately be the target of Iraqi chemical weapons, although that's scarcely likely to be deliberate.
You pointed out some days ago that actually the last time that the Iraqis fired missiles against the Israelis, you pointed out that one of the things they may be doing is effectively taking their range. You still believe that to be so?
Well, that's exactly right, and they now know that they can hit, if they fire enough missiles, somewhere in Israeli cities. Now, they have threatened to set Israel on fire. They can't do that. The best warhead, let's assume that they have something equivalent to a Soviet warhead and they're using persistent nerve gas. That's the most lethal weapon they could use. It would be sheer chance if they could get a large area in Tel Aviv, even if the missile hit in Tel Aviv. But we have to put this into perspective. If it was a Soviet warhead, if it was that sophisticated, that kind of warhead could produce 5% casualties over an area perhaps 5 miles by 10 miles under worst-case conditions. That is a very broad lethal area. And there is still another problem here. With their Su-24s, with their aircraft, if those are sheltered, if there are chemical bombs in those aircraft, it is just possible that 1 or 2 might get through even Israel's superb air defenses.
Tony, let me interrupt you now and bring in a couple of other specialists who are standing by. Bill Quandt, who has been a Middle East specialist for many years, who is now with the Brookings Institution, and a resident scholar with the Brookings Institution, Josh Epstein, who is also a military analyst. But Bill Quandt, let me go to you first. The political impact of this. Again, we have been speculating a lot, and I guess at this hour that is all we can do. But the reality of what we know is that twice now in 48 hours, the Iraqis have launched missiles against Israel. They have landed in Israel. They have caused some casualties. The political pressure domestically that is going to bring upon the Israeli government is sure to be great. In your estimation, do you think it is possible that they can still hold back and not respond?
I would be very surprised if they didn't respond now. I think they showed forbearance after the first attack. I don't think they will for very much longer. There's still a question, though, of what will they retaliate against. It's not going to be easy to find military targets that are going to remove the kind of threat that Tony Quartesman just described. Presumably, we have as good intelligence as anyone about these sites, and it's not clear to me that the Israelis can do very much to reduce the threat on their own. It's occurred to me that they may choose to retaliate with the surface-to-surface missiles of their own, simply to demonstrate that they have the same kind of capabilities, and it's quite possible that theirs are even more accurate. That would also relieve the Jordanians of this dilemma that Crown Prince Hassan was referring to earlier. What do we do if Israeli planes come over? He almost said we would feel under some obligation to take action. If a missile goes over Jordan, Jordan can't do anything about it.
Josh Epstein, talk for a moment, if you would, about Israeli missile capability and what kind of damage they could cause.
Well, they could cause substantial damage, and as Bill Quandt suggests, they have much more accurate missiles of much greater range and payload than anything in the Iraqi arsenal. The Jericho series of missiles is quite sophisticated by any standards. One additional point that has not been brought up that I think deserves some consideration, retaliation doesn't necessarily mean air power or missiles. It's conceivable that the Israelis have people on the ground in Iraq armed with devices that could be set off at strategic locations in Iraq or even military installations in Iraq. It's impossible for me to believe that they don't have agents in that country, and they may be armed with devices that they can retaliate with without overflying anyone's airspace.
And in terms of the, I mean, you seem to be offering a military solution that is also a political solution for the Israelis, because clearly what nobody wants to have happen right now, least of all the Israelis, least of all the Jordanians, is to get those two countries embroiled and drawn into this war.
Right, I think that's one way to go. It doesn't tell you what targets are worth blowing up at this point, but if you must retaliate also as a political rather than military act, that is one way to do it. It's interesting that this entire exchange would be political rather than military. The Iraqis' goal is political in attacking, and the Israelis' goal in retaliating is also political.
Bill Quandt, in a bizarre fashion, Saddam Hussein has shown himself to be really quite cunning. If he succeeds in drawing the Israelis into this battle, he will have gained a lot, won't he?
Well, not militarily, certainly.
Not militarily, that's right.
Politically, there's a chance that certainly in the street there is already probably a strong reaction among some in Jordan and perhaps the Palestinians saying that maybe after all Saddam Hussein can do something to hurt the Israelis. But in fact, he hasn't done very much. Also, I don't think all this talk about splitting the coalition is terribly realistic if this is the kind of exchange that is likely to be taking place between Iraq and Israel. I don't see that if Israel retaliates with a missile launch or two of its own, or even a few overflights, it's going to fundamentally unravel the coalition. The Egyptians are solid, the Saudis are solid. The Syrians I have always wondered about, and I don't think they're going to be very active participants in this war in any case. So I'm rather dubious about the proposition that the coalition against Iraq will collapse overnight if the Israelis retaliate. Of course, if it becomes a big Israeli-Iraqi confrontation that goes on and on and on over a number of days and even into weeks, then, of course, all bets are off.
All right. We, of course, have been dealing in speculation. We don't know what the Israelis are going to do, but apparently we're likely to find out very soon. Even though it is the Jewish Sabbath, it is now about 20 after 11 in the morning, Saturday, in Israel. Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir has just called an emergency session of his cabinet together. They are going to be meeting very shortly, and undoubtedly the decision of what the Israelis will do is going to come out of that session. So in a few hours, we will know. When we come back, we will talk to the ABC cameraman who shot that unforgettable video of the bombing of Baghdad by Allied forces, and we'll be talking with another journalist who was also in Baghdad during the opening salvos of the war.
If after test driving a Sterling, you find another car with all of its standard features and appointments for $28,500 or less, we'll do more than congratulate you. We'll buy it for you.
What makes a child seat safe is how an adult uses it. To make sure you're using your child seat right, see an Allstate agent for a free booklet.
It's a wall-to-wall sellout at Auto West Toyota.
If you told me yesterday I could buy this car at this price,
The dealing's not done till you deal with us.
I don't know how they do it, but I'm sure glad they do.
No one can save you, two-wheel drive trucks, $49 down or $99 a month. Save $5,000 on a Toyota. 4x4s, $49 down or $179 a month. Get to Fremont Boulevard in Fremont now. Auto West Toyota, the Toyota warehouse. It's the time to buy. Once a year, there's a coat sale so big it breaks records. Right now, Burlington Coat Factory has slashed its already low prices on over 2 million coats during its once-a-year warehouse sale. It's America's greatest coat sale with tremendous savings on top-name coats for women, men, and children, plus sportswear and men's famous label suits at the lowest prices of the season now. Don't wait. At these prices, they won't hang around long. Save now on coats and so much more during Burlington's once-a-year warehouse sale.
Does it seem like some stores play games with low sale prices? Well, at Office Club, our prices are low every day. That's why you'll always get a great low price on this AT&T cordless telephone 4200. It's just $59.99. And this AT&T cordless speakerphone 5500 is at Office Club for a low price of just $159.99. So why play games? Get to Office Club if you want a great low price on a great AT&T phone when you want it. Because at Office Club, we don't play games with our prices.
For many of us, the war began when ABC News correspondent Gary Shepard told Peter Jennings on the air that the skies over Baghdad had lit up early Thursday morning with anti-aircraft fire. And some of the most dramatic images that we have seen thus far were shot by ABC News cameraman Fabrice Mousses. We'll be talking with him live in just a couple of minutes. He and Gary Shepard arrived in Amman, Jordan today after a day-long trip through Iraq, and we asked them to sit down and recall the start of the war.
Few shells, then the siren came up.
This is about 2:45 in the morning, because that's about 5 minutes after we got those first twinkles in the sky. And I looked out, and I was on the phone live with New York, and I said, gee, something's going on here.
And here I quickly realized the limitation of, the normal lens, so then I switched to a night lens. You will see the difference. And there was a direct hit. And at that point, not only I felt a concussion right against my body, but here, I mean, I could feel the heat.
There's another one over to the right of it.
Listen to this. This is a lot of noise from the anti-aircraft guns. And what's interesting is that you never hear the airplanes. They must be really, really high. I mean, I never saw an airplane.
Now, I think I was on the air at this point, on the phone to New York, because I remember talking about that big flash, and it was about 12 minutes in. But, it was hard to remember what I said, because I was trying to think of all the words to describe so much that was going on. That's the, what building is that?
Well, that's the Foreign Ministry. That's an anti-aircraft gun that was right on top of the Foreign Ministry.
Well, they had these anti-aircraft batteries on a lot of those buildings.
Yeah, and as you can see, they let the lights in a lot of the building on. The city didn't go too dark until very late. You know this, didn't you?
They really weren't ready for this.
Yeah, I think it caught them off guard. And I'll show you something else, if you recall. Now, I thought it was very dark. I didn't think this was going to show up at all, but we see.
Oh, yeah, look at this.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe that people were running out in the street.
Yeah. People running in their pajamas to a shelter. Now we are in the second air raid. And you will hear, I mean, there was some frightening sound.
No, it really was terrifying. But somehow, being in the hotel, you had the feeling that it was never going to hit the hotel. I don't know why. Probably.
Yeah, I must say, I think I felt tense, but I was never particularly afraid because a lot of the targets were on the outskirts. Like, for example, this past this water tower, and this is very far, but something is burning in the distance.
You know what's funny now? Here it is, 1991. I was thinking about whether Dresden was anything like this in the Second World War. You always hear about the bombing of Dresden.
The only thing is that from this, I mean, I clearly had the impression that they were avoiding residential areas.
You know what's really funny? This only happened 2 nights ago, and it seems like a month has gone by.
Yeah, we've seen a lot.
And joining us now from Amman is the man who shot that extraordinary footage, ABC cameraman Fabrice Moussis, along with freelance journalist Michael Kelly, who was on assignment in Baghdad for the New Republic and the Boston Globe and is just back from a 27-hour drive through the Iraqi desert. Fabrice, I'd like to begin with you, and not so much with that extraordinary video that you shot. I once had a friend who was a cameraman tell me that when he has that camera on his shoulder and he's looking through the lens, he almost feels as though he's watching a movie. He doesn't feel as though he's there. Having said that, now let me just ask you, did you have that same sense?
You do, but your subconscious also is working all the time, and all your senses tell you that it's serious, it's really happening. But what you do is you concentrate. You concentrate on your work, on the visuals. And yes, it creates a bit of a distance, but you're still very much aware of what's happening around you.
Now, as you know, a couple of days ago, the Nightline team and I were there in Amman, where you are standing right now, and indeed we had been trying for some days to get into Baghdad, and were unable to do so. We couldn't get a visa, and we couldn't get in. But knowing that war was likely, we discussed down in Amman how we would get out again if the war began. You must have thought much more urgently about the same things. What kinds of plans did you and Gary and some of the others have in the event that the Iraqis had not been as cooperative as they were in driving you down to the border?
Well, actually, I had thought that the safest place would be the Iranian border, because nobody would bother to attack in that area. And I thought that the best place then would be to go to Kurdistan, because the Kurds probably would be cooperative. But I never felt that we had to resort to that last solution.
Did you have an opportunity to talk to Iraqi officials about it even before the war, or was it only after the bombing began that you came into contact with them and discussed how you could get out?
No, we were able to talk to them until the end. Actually, what was interesting is that a couple of Iraqi officials came and talked to me, very concerned until the end, and asked me what is going to happen, and they expressed that their wish that the government be overthrown very soon. And they were actually sort of looking forward to it.
Really? Is that, Michael, an emotion that you heard expressed by others over the last few days that you were there?
Yes, it is. It's an emotion that people are very careful about expressing in Iraq, since it's a capital offense to say anything that's critical of Saddam Hussein. And journalists who were there as recently as a month ago found that almost nobody except government officials would speak to them, and those officials spoke only the party line. But as the days got closer to the war here, the controls that have existed in Iraq began to break down, and people on the street began to come up to American reporters, to come up to them in private moments and meet them in cars and so on, and tell them what they really thought of Saddam Hussein and what they really thought of this war. One man told me, a man who had previously told me that Saddam Hussein is the best, Saddam Hussein is a great man, and so on, told me the day before the war, took me aside and said, I just want to tell you one thing. From the beginning of his life to now, Saddam Hussein is a criminal. You must realize that.
Did you have the sense on the 14th of January that war was going to come? And I guess more to the point, did the Iraqis with whom you spoke actually believe that it was going to happen?
I had the sense that war was going to come, and I think most journalists there did, but I think that judging from interviews with Iraqis on the street on the 14th, that a lot of Iraqis until the very end held out hope that war would not happen. The week before the war was a series of sort of fat chances playing through Baghdad, people coming in with one or another peace plan. And the Iraqis we talked to all said that they didn't want a war, they didn't want this fight, and they all seemed to hold out hope until the very end that it wouldn't happen.
What I'd like to get into in a moment, and we're going to take a break just now, but what I'd like to get into with both of you when we come back is a little bit about the atmospherics during the bombing and immediately after the bombing. I should point out that Michael Kelly spent some time in the streets after the bombing attack the following morning. We'll be back with Michael Kelly and with Fabrice in just a moment.
No matter where you live in this region, go to the Source. For the first time ever, get 1991 Fords at fleet prices at the Source. Sunnyvale Ford. Choose from 300 1991 Ford cars and trucks. Below retail. And pay nothing till April. $49 delivered. Make no payments. Till April. 1991. Buy below retail. This sale ends Sunday, January 20th. Don't be left in the dark. Go to the Source. Sunnyvale Ford. El Camino Real between Fair Oaks and Wolf. If you wait, you will pay more.
Hey, how about some rich, fudgy, chocolatey, homemade brownies?
Homemade? No. Too hard to make.
Not with new Baker's Chocolate One Bowl brownies. It's the world's easiest homemade brownie recipe because it all happens in one bowl.
Mom's got a bowl.
In a little more time than a mix, with real Baker's Chocolate, you could have the richest, fudgiest homemade brownies.
I'll never make brownies from a mix again.
New Baker's Chocolate One Bowl brownie recipe. Homemade? You've never had it so easy.
And joining us once again live from Amman, Jordan, freelance journalist Michael Kelly and ABC cameraman Fabrice Moussis. Fabrice, talk a little bit about the what was there in the morning when you were finally able to see clearly through the hotel windows. Were you able to leave the hotel at all and go out?
Yes, Ted. I was able to leave the hotel, but without a camera. And I went with my driver and drove around town. And what I saw was direct hits on the International Telecommunications building, and I could see that it was like microsurgery. I mean, there was a gaping hole on the side, another one through a window, but none of the buildings around had been hit except for broken glass. And there were a few other buildings, and there was still smoke coming out along the Tigris River. The Defense Ministry had been hit.
Now, when you and Gary were looking at some of that video before, he raised the parallel of Dresden. Of course, keeping in mind now what you just said, that is exactly the wrong parallel, because Dresden, you had the sort of firebombing where whole neighborhoods went up in smoke, and from what you're saying, this is exactly the opposite. In other words, a dot here, a dot there, but all the targets they aimed for, apparently they got. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, my feeling was that the air attack was very, very precise, and they made sure that they were not going to hit any residential areas. It was only a few targets within the city, and everything else was on the outskirts of the city, probably the airport, factories, and the palace.
Fabrice, I know you have been in and out of Baghdad many times over the years, so you probably know that city as well as any of us, better than most of us. Can you give us a sense of what kinds of targets they hit that you were able to see?
Yes, they hit communication center. They hit the palace area, although we cannot see the palace directly from the road, but the area of the palace. As I said, ministries, and I was also told by a colleague of mine that a couple of houses had been hit, and however, nobody had been killed. The people had been taken to hospital with only light wounds.
Michael Kelly, you also spent considerable time, not only after the raid, but as I understand it, between raids out on the street. You want to tell us about that?
I went out pretty much as soon as they let journalists out early in the morning, which I guess was around 9 o'clock or something like that, with another reporter, Richard Beeston of the Times of London, and a driver. We had a good driver who knew his way around town, and we went around looking for things that had been hit. We didn't actually plan to go out between raids or during a raid, but as we were driving along at about 10:30 in the morning, we saw a heavy black smoke over from the direction of the Defense Ministry by the river, and went over there. And as we were getting right in front of it, across from the river from it, they hit it a second time, apparently with a cruise missile, at about 10:35. And as Fabrice was saying, the astonishing thing about this was the pinpoint accuracy of it. We were close enough to it to actually feel the explosion and the shudder in the ground and so on, and to see the smoke close up and everything, but nothing around that building, and there are houses and a hospital around it, had been touched at all, apparently. And they hit it with the third shot 5 minutes later in 10 minutes flat. They had hit 3 times the heart of the armed forces in the heart of the city of Baghdad with absolutely no defense.
Now, I understand that the way these weapon systems are used, that in fact is the intent, that they hit it first, open it up, then hit it again, do more damage inside, and perhaps, if need be, hit it a third time, each time penetrating more and more deeply into the target.
That's right, and I think one of the things that really impressed me going out during the day on Thursday was not only the accuracy of the bombing, but how absolutely ineffectual Baghdad's air defenses were. Baghdad has a great many anti-aircraft guns that are evident on the roofs of buildings and on earthenware mounds around the city, and they look impressive, but they didn't seem to have any ability to stop the Allied planes and missiles from doing anything they wanted, coming in, striking what they wanted, and leaving.
Fabrice, I know you've covered a number of wars in your time. I don't know how familiar you are, particularly when you're shooting it at night, between anti-aircraft fire and, for example, surface-to-air missiles. Were there any missiles used?
From the sound, I had the feeling that there were missiles used, but I did not see any. There was an incredible amount of anti-aircraft attack guns. You could hear them cracking in the sky. But as Mike said, you also had the feeling that their range was not enough to get to American airplanes.
Did you ever discover, Michael, whether and all of this anti-aircraft fire, of course, the spent bullets would be coming back down to earth again? Was anybody injured by that? Did you have a chance to meet and talk with Baghdadis after the raid?
I stuck around Baghdad till about 3:30 in the afternoon, and out on the streets talked to some people and saw a good many of them. And I didn't see any evidence that kind of thing was happening. There was no evidence of panic, people running through the streets, screaming, anything like that. There were very few people on the streets, and those that were, some of them were, in fact, almost sort of strolling along, maybe making a show of defiance. You would see young men with Kalashnikov rifles and so on walking along. I even saw a garbage man going about his rounds, picking up his garbage in the middle of the raid on the defense ministry.
Before I let the two of you go, Fabrice, we've heard a little bit from you about the trip from Amman, or rather from Baghdad down to Amman. Michael, anything notable about your trip? Anything interesting along the way?
There are a couple interesting things, most of which I think you know about already. The Scud missiles that we all saw heading towards Saudi Arabia or the border here. For me personally, the most interesting thing was getting lost on a highway heading the wrong direction at 1 o'clock in the morning and finding myself in the middle of heavy anti-aircraft fire as a bombing attack went on what was apparently a phosphorus factory nearby. But that was as interesting as I wanted it to get.
Yeah, I can imagine. That goes beyond interesting into terrifying.
It really was, yeah.
Yeah. I could add.
Yeah, no, I mean, give us a little thumbnail sketch of the trip. You left at what time of day and how?
I left a little later. I left about 4:30 Baghdad time, and it took me about 24 hours because the border was closed and we had to sleep on the border. But during our trip, I could add that I did see some Scud missiles on the back of trucks, low trucks with 8 wheels, and they consist of little units. You have about 2 Jeeps, then you have a light truck with anti-aircraft on it, and they drive without any headlights on or just one little headlight. And it's a very small unit, and you get the feeling that they're very mobile and they could drive in the sand if they had to.
You know, Fabrice, I wanted to ask you this when we got the chance to talk again. As you know, your video that you shot came out before you did because you gave at least a copy of it. I don't know whether it was the original, to an ITN cameraman who was on this broadcast yesterday and told us that he brought it out in his underwear. Why did you give it to him?
We have a reciprocal agreement with this company, and he was leaving before us, and also we wanted to make sure that the pictures went out in more than one way. We never know what might happen to it, and I understand that as the pictures came out of the satellite. They were not properly identified, and therefore all the other networks took the pictures and thought it was theirs or they could use it, although these pictures are ABC's pictures.
No, you were a real hero over at the other networks, I can assure you. But tell me, how did you get your material out? Because I gather that at the border the Iraqis were rather sensitive about material that you were taking out of the country.
No, they were not. You might have expected that, and we were ready for that, but such was not the case. Actually, I must say, the Iraqi government was, the Ministry of Information was very helpful until the last minute. They were very concerned all the time about, you know, that we had proper transportation. They facilitated our exit at the border. They were fine with us.
No, the only reason I raise it is because the ITN crew did have trouble. They did have some film taken from them, even out of the personal cameras, and some video taken. So it's kind of strange. I guess it all depends on when you got there and who the border guards were.
I think so. It's probably a little bit luck of the draw. But I've done this also more than once.
Fabrice Moussis, who certainly has done it more than once. He is one of our most experienced cameramen in the Middle East. That was a videotape conversation that we did earlier this evening. We are now back live, and indeed there is some rather dramatic news from the border between Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Let me just read you. This is compiled from pool reports. You know that reporters are not able independently to go along with U.S. military units, but pool reporters are sent who then come back and have to share that information with the rest of the journalists. American planes and helicopter gunships killed an estimated 40 Iraqi soldiers in attacks on occupied Kuwait on Friday, U.S. officers said on Saturday. The reports from U.S. Marine Corps officers said that 4 Marines were wounded, 1 seriously, by shrapnel when Iraqi artillery inside Kuwait shelled Marines near the Saudi border, and that was near the town of Kafi. Earlier reports said 3 Americans had been slightly wounded. 2 U.S. Air Force A-10 aircraft attacked the Iraqi battery on Friday morning, killing an estimated 30 Iraqi soldiers and heavily damaging their guns. And that is what the Marines are quoted as saying. So in that sense, the first ground exchange has taken place, and the first ground U.S. troops have been injured.
Since we have been on the air. You know, we won't take a long time right now to try to assess what this military briefing really means in the course of the overall campaign, but joining us from Washington is our resident military analyst, Tony Cordesman. Tony, gives us a sense of what you're hearing. One thing I hear is this shift from purely air to the beginning of air-ground war, right or wrong?
Right, I think that's very clear, but I think we need to understand we're being warned again and again and again just how many targets there are, that it's going to probably take days to get to the point where we fully suppress the air defenses over all of the country, and we'll have to suppress them again and again. However, 2 key messages, Peter. You're absolutely right. It's clear we are shifting to attack the ground targets. It's clear it's going to take thousands and thousands of sorties to do that, perhaps over a period as long as a week. We also heard there's a build-up to 460,000 men. Now, just yesterday, it was 450,000. And when the president talked about completing the deployment, it was just about this number. That indicates that we're closing with virtually all of our armor, getting ready to be fully prepared for the ground phase.
The other thing I heard this afternoon, I think perhaps the most discouraging report, I use the discouraging with a very small d, is how difficult it is to do this thing called BDA, bomb damage assessment, the day after. So they're insisting, at least to reporters in Washington, they don't have a really good handle on how much they've destroyed.
I think that's absolutely fair, and unfortunately there's something of a Super Bowl mentality there. From a military viewpoint, what counts is they can't send anything up, their surface-to-air missiles aren't effective, we can operate freely over the areas where they have their ground forces. It doesn't really matter whether we've destroyed X number of aircraft if they can't fly them and they can't use them.
Now, there are 150,000 members, roughly, of the Republican Guard dug in Kuwait. General Kelly says we're beginning to hammer them. We're hitting them as hard as we can. What can they withstand?
Well, the problem, again, is destroying all of them is nearly impossible. Not only are there 150,000 men, but as a very rough estimate, we're talking about 50,000 vehicles, perhaps 30 or 40 major concentrations. But if you knock out the command and control capability, if you paralyze them, get rid of their supplies, which are vulnerable, if they can't move, they can't fight.
Okay, Tony Cordesman in Washington, thank you very much. We don't need you to remind ourselves of this, but we do on a regular basis anyway. This has a kind of antiseptic quality to it, all this discussion about ammunition and aircraft and everything else, but this is not a bloodless campaign by any means. A lot of people are clearly dying. You've heard how many Allied airmen have died, not in air-to-air combat, but shot down. You've already heard how many Iraqis have been shot down, but it is clear from the reporting that men are dying in every theater of battle. Let's go to the White House, where ABC's Ann Compton has been talking to the President's press secretary, who's still up at Camp David, right, Ann?
He is, and he met for 2 hours with the bosses of the gentleman who just briefed the press. He got his own briefing, and we understand that basically what the President's being told is the same thing we are getting here. The President was particularly pleased to hear what his briefers talked about, the air defense system. The White House would like to think that Saddam Hussein's air defense system is fairly, the destruction of it is a fairly complete success, less success than the command and control system. The President was in the briefing and left about a half an hour after it began to telephone Yitzhak Shamir. That is his third phone call to the Israeli Prime Minister in the last day or so, and it was to again thank the Prime Minister for Israel showing restraint. There's no question here, Peter, that the administration is breathing a sigh of relief tonight that with the Patriots going in, the ones that will now be manned by the American forces, and with his absolute promise to Shamir, they're doing everything they can in western Iraq to defeat the weather and find those Scud missile launchers and take them out, that he has promised that they will do everything they can, and asking Shamir to hold off once again on any kind of retaliation.
Okay, and let me interrupt you in a second, because Pete Williams was asked a question at the Pentagon briefing he couldn't answer, but might be important. Has the President, to the best of your knowledge, talked to any of the Arab leaders in the coalition about how he's coming to Israel's assistance?
He has not, according to those that we've talked to. There haven't been the network of phone calls that the President usually accomplishes, but they do indicate that this was clearly understood among the coalition partners before the first shots were ever fired.
Okay, Ann Compton of the White House, thank you very much. Want to go to Saudi Arabia now, where ABC's Sam Donaldson is standing by. Sam, you've been listening to the briefing. Does it reflect what you feel and see and think on the ground?
Absolutely, Peter, particularly your conversation with Ann Compton. The military command here is keenly aware that they have got to find those Scuds. They've got to take the Scuds out. The political and psychological damage that continued firings on Israel would create in this war is simply incalculable. All day, for instance, from the Red Sea ports, the airfields there, our F-111s have been taking off. They're one of the most seen here. They're one of the most effective weapons against the Scud, but they, as you have heard, have been hampered by bad weather in western Iraq. But they are looking. Now, here in the eastern province, we have the Patriot missiles, the ones that are being sent to Israel. They've been very effective. In fact, the Patriot missile in combat, Peter, is now batting 1,000. 2 nights ago, a Scud came over this hotel and was blown out of the sky at about 30,000 feet by a Patriot. And yet, the system does have its problems. Earlier today, curiously enough, in Riyadh, the capital, there were Patriot firings. They were accidental. 2 Patriots actually got off the ground. There were no Scud missiles, and as far as the U.S. command has been able to determine, these were accidental firings of the missile. Of course, that's still being investigated.
We could just see their conch shells up in the sky, Sam, in this piece of videotape.
Exactly. Why they were fired, no one knows. It might have been an accident. Someone pushed the wrong button. It might have been some technical problem in the system. Peter, I want to say that there was a pool report that was just arrived here that's interesting because it tells for the first time of skirmishes on the border between Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, between Iraqi troops and U.S. forces. The report is very sketchy. It simply says that U.S. and Iraqi patrols along the heavily fortified Kuwaiti border clashed. There were several clashes. These clearly were not major engagements, but simply little small skirmishes. There is no report of casualties on either side. The clashes are not apparently continuing. But if this pool report is correct, that represents the first known ground contact between our 2 sides.
Okay, Sam, thanks very much. Sam Donaldson in eastern Saudi Arabia. Those reports on skirmishes along the border between U.S. and Iraqi forces have emphasized, as they've dribbled in throughout the day, that it was, as Sam said, not particularly serious. Just want to check in one more place before we leave, and that is with Dean Reynolds in Israel. It's 12 minutes after 11 at night there. Dean, has the mood in the country as best you can tell, changed since the Patriots have arrived?
Well, there is relief to some extent, Peter, although I must say the weather forecast of bad weather in western Iraq gives people some chills here. I think there would be a great deal more anger in the country had the casualties been higher, and certainly if an Israeli had been killed in these attacks, the Israeli government position might be a bit stronger. But there is something of a dilemma here. After all, the Israelis must be asking themselves what, if anything, they could do above and beyond what the United States is already doing to the Iraqis, especially to those missile launchers. But I think we're in for another nervous evening. We've already had one false alarm about almost 2 hours ago, and fortunately an all clear was sounded soon thereafter.
Dean, thanks very much. Dean Reynolds in Jerusalem, and of course he raises the question that has been on everybody's mind today. If the U.S. is doing everything it can in western Iraq, including the problems with the bad weather, and the U.S. has such a sophisticated operation over Iraq these days, what more could the Israelis do? But as Dean Reynolds says, perhaps they are resting just somewhat easier tonight, though Pete Williams went out of his way to say at the Pentagon briefing here, there is no such thing as a perfect defense system. The war in the Persian Gulf continues. We'll be back every hour on the hour. I'm Peter Jennings.
This has been a special report.
This is a special report from Channel 7 News.
And a good afternoon. I'm Don Sanchez in the Channel 7 newsroom. As America sends those Patriot missiles to Israel to combat the Iraqi Scud missiles, thousands of Californians are turning out today to show either their support or their opposition to the Persian Gulf War. And by far the largest crowd in the state is turning out here in San Francisco, the largest protest in 5 days of demonstrations. They organized at Dolores Park and have marched to the Civic Center in San Francisco for a rally. Channel 7's Aaron Edwards is in front of City Hall right now, and he has the latest. Aaron.
Well, Don, this is the Civic Center Plaza, as you state, right across the street from the City Hall. And the main body of the march hasn't yet arrived here. And we understand that it got so large as it was approaching here from Dolores Park that actually they had to change the route of the march in order to accommodate the crowd. They had to go down Market Street, which was not part of their original plan. From overhead, you might be able to see that the crowd is a large one. And even before the main body of this march arrives here at Civic Center, there have been at least 2,000 to 3,000 people who came directly here, chose not to participate in the march. But it's kind of a picnic atmosphere in spite of it all. It's serious as could be, a little bit picnic-like, because you can buy here books and literature and hot or cold food and cold drinks. You can even get appropriate T-shirts. But let's ask about the march itself, and this is Jane Cutter, who is with one of the organizing organizations, the Emergency Committee to Stop the U.S. War in the Middle East. Jane, where do these people come from? Who are they?
People from all walks of life. We have black, white, gay, straight, young and old, people from churches, labor unions, and all different communities here in San Francisco and the greater Bay Area, and in fact from all over the state.
Do you have any idea how many people are expected to be here?
I've heard word that there are hundreds of thousands of people on the march, up to 250,000.
Well, we'll be able to get a better picture when they get here, but let me ask you about the violence. In the past days, every time there's been a march, there has been some resultant violence. How do you control it, and do you have monitors?
We do have very many monitors, but we want to put all this in perspective. There's a war going on. The biggest violence is happening in Iraq right now, being committed by the U.S. military. We are planning, this is a peaceful, legal, massive demonstration against the war. The numbers are showing that people are against the war, the people who are coming out here today, and we anticipate this to be a very successful and strong statement against the war.
What's the role of the monitors? How do they keep people from branching off?
They're here to help people out, to watch out for difficulties, and to be as supportive of the marchers as possible.
Thanks very much. Let me stress that there are all kinds of signs, anti-war expressions, but there are some expressing the other side as well. All the Way USA is one that I've seen several times, but there are no confrontations. Everything has been peaceful, and let us hope it continues that way. Don?
And free enterprise, obviously, flourishing there, Aaron, as you say, T-shirts and other items. Do you have any idea how soon the bulk of the crowd will be there?
Yes, they say they're several blocks away, and this place should fill up in a great hurry and pour out into the streets as well.
All right, Aaron Edwards, thank you for that report from the Civic Center. You hear the organizers estimating the crowd at perhaps 250,000. San Francisco police half an hour ago said perhaps the crowd was only 20,000. We'll have to check back and see. By the way, San Francisco Mayor Art Agnos says that the anti-war protests are costing the city $100,000 a day in police overtime. And during the last 5 days, 1,700 people have been arrested in angry, noisy, and often violent protests. They're hoping today that won't be the case here. We'll continue to monitor that demonstrations as well as events in the Gulf, and we'll provide you with updated reports throughout the day. I'm Don Sanchez.
By the Geneva Convention, an official replied, Iraq respects all international conventions. The Iraqis claim to have prisoners of war, and a State Department official says the U.S. assumes that is true. 9 Allied planes have been lost in combat since the war began. U.S. military officials in Saudi Arabia confirmed Saturday that a number of Iraqi POWs have been taken into Allied custody.
We have taken 12 Iraqi prisoners, and they're presently aboard the Kuwaiti patrol boat and the USS Nicholas. The Iraqi soldiers will be transferred to a U.S. Marine holding facility and eventually to a POW camp.
As host country to the Allied force, Saudi Arabia takes responsibility for detaining Iraqi prisoners. The other diplomatic note handed to the Iraqi diplomat was about the presence of 2 U.S. military hospital ships in the Arabian Peninsula. The clear message, both vessels are out of bounds for warfare. A participant in Saturday's meeting says both sides also used the short session to reiterate their long-standing positions about Kuwait. But as one noted, the only new ground being covered now is on the battlefield. Candy Crowley, CNN at the State Department.
Just wanted to add that during that meeting, the United States repeated its position that, that Iraq should get out of Kuwait, but Iraq is in no mood yet to cry uncle. I'm Frances Harden, CNN, reporting live at the State Department.
Thank you, Francis. CNN's Rick Salinger is in eastern Saudi Arabia. He's been watching planes, equipment, and men coming and going and coming and going and coming and going again, I guess, Rick. Tell us about what's going on there.
That's right. Phase 1 of this war, the air attack, continues unabated. 24-hour hits round the clock, no rest, even though today is Sunday. And as these sorties continue, word filters back to us about individual successes. One in particular comes from about 20 miles north of the border of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. That's inside Kuwait. And it involves a raid on a tower. There, a Harrier raid took place by the 3rd Marine Air Wing. They say they obliterated a radio communications complex. According to a combat pool report received here today, dated yesterday, it's believed the tower was being used to pass information along to Iraqi field commanders. Now, 4 Harriers like these, each carrying 4 1,000-pound cluster bombs, made 2 passes over the tower in the hour and 15-minute raid. No one saw any ground fire. The pilots say they're not getting nearly as much resistance as they thought. Now, the cluster bombs that they dropped level everything that they hit. Each one has 270 bomblets, and we are told the force of that is equal to about 30 hand grenades. There will be one other type of air activity from the airport near us this afternoon, and this one involves civilians for the first time since this war began. In just a few hours, a military plane is expected to be taking off on a voluntary departure for U.S. citizens and their dependents who have chosen to leave eastern Saudi Arabia. They will be taken to an undisclosed location, perhaps somewhere in Europe, a safe place if they so choose. Reporting live from eastern Saudi Arabia, I'm Rick Salinger, CNN.
Rick, you and everybody else have had their eyes on the skies, but real concern is turning towards the ground skirmishes that we hear are going on the Kuwaiti-Saudi Arabia border. What do you know about that?
Well, I think the key word that you mentioned there is skirmishes. It does not indicate a start of any ground war. What we're hearing up there, in particular from the Marines, is that every so often, perhaps each night now, they are receiving some artillery fire from the Iraqi troops. No one has been seriously hurt. However, about 4 Marines and 1 sailor have been injured in these attacks. And what is happening is, once the artillery fire is being received, attack helicopters, Cobras are being sent to knock out the Iraqi artillery positions. In fact, one Marine said he can't understand why the Iraqis are doing this at all. All they're doing is expending their ammunition and revealing their positions. They say it's merely harassment.
That's CNN's Rick Salinger reporting for us live this morning from eastern Saudi Arabia. Thanks, Rick. We'll be in touch. Stay with us. Our Gulf War coverage continues. Gulf War, some might argue the war really began back during the first week in August when Iraq invaded Kuwait. With a look back at that first week in August, David French has this Iraq timeline report.
Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/21425 please raise their hand.
The condemnation was unanimous at the United Nations. By a vote of 14-0, the UN Security Council demanded the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of Iraqi forces.
I feel bitterness and I'm rather embarrassed to be in this situation, in this assembly, in order to review a military invasion made by a friendly country.
The events taking place in Kuwait relate to an internal matter which is not a concern to the Council.
I want to express not just a sense of dismay, but also a sense of disgust that this kind of thing can still happen in 1990.
The United States has made it clear that it will stand shoulder to shoulder with Kuwait in this time of crisis.
In what could well be an unprecedented move, the Soviet Union issued a joint statement with the U.S. condemning the Iraqi invasion.
Let me tell you that it was a rather difficult decision for us to make the kind of statements that we made yesterday, and also to be making this joint statement because of the long-standing good relations that we've had with Iraq and that have been evolving for decades.
The Kuwaitis were grateful for the support. Kuwait's ambassador had appealed for help earlier in the day, but the ambassador also clearly felt bewildered and betrayed by the Iraqi invasion.
Yes, we knew about their concentration. Yes, we knew about their intentions. But we have been assured by prominent heads of state all along that the Iraqis have given their word that they will not use military force. We have opened our hand to them repeatedly. And I'm not talking during their war with Iran and Iraq. I'm talking in recent times, in assisting their development programs. And that's how grateful they are. And this is what we got for being neighborly and friendly.
Iraq, however, said it did not invade Kuwait. It was invited in by a group of rebels who had overthrown the Kuwaiti government.
The Iraqi forces will be withdrawn as soon as the situation is settled down. And as soon as the free government of Kuwait has so wished. We hope that this will be a matter of few days or few weeks at the latest.
The invasion began at dawn Thursday, just hours after Iraq broke off talks with Kuwait aimed at resolving differences diplomatically. With thousands of troops already massed along the border with Kuwait, it was just a simple matter of crossing over and marching toward the capital. Kuwait's 20,000 troops were no match for the invaders. Witnesses say the Iraqi Air Force viciously bombarded Kuwaiti ports and military airports. More than 200 Kuwaitis were killed, including a member of the royal family who died defending the palace. President Bush took immediate action.
I signed an executive order early this morning freezing Iraqi assets in this country and prohibiting transactions with Iraq. I've also signed an executive order freezing Kuwaiti assets. And now that's to ensure that those assets are not interfered with by the illegitimate authority that is now occupying Kuwait.
In a matter of hours, Iraq's Saddam Hussein had made history by invading another Arab country and taking control of its government. At the same time, the invasion put him in firm control of Kuwait's oil fields, including the disputed Rumalia oil wells along the border, and gave his landlocked country better access to the Persian Gulf. In one fell swoop, Hussein had seized control of 7% of the world's oil production. oil prices went crazy. In London, North Sea Brent crude oil jumped to more than $23 a barrel, up from $20 the day before. Prices at the pump in the United States went up overnight. U.S. motorists were furious.
What can you do about it? You need the gas and you got to drive.
The little guy always gets it.
I don't think it's fair, but what's fair in life?
They're making money before they have to. Why don't they wait until they have to fill up their pumps at the new price before they make us pay the increase? It's not fair.
Some analysts agree